Hello everybody, I'm going to be giving a brief presentation on the Executive Order 13855, which deals with wildfires, national parks, and the National Park Management Program. The reason why this executive order was put into place was because it was responding to the deadly wildfires in 2017 and 2018. There are several acts that are the main basis for this executive order, one being the Yellowstone National Park Act, which was signed in 1872. What the Yellowstone National Park Act did was establish the world's first true national park. It had established 2 million acres of land from Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho to compose this park, and it also defined what a national park is. Essentially, a national park is land intended to not be occupied or sold, but rather to be enjoyed by the public. It also made the Secretary of Interior responsible for the park and for preserving all timber, mineral deposits, geological wonders, etc. Keep in mind that the Secretary of Interior is responsible for preserving timber. The second act is the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969. Essentially, this means that federal agencies can carry out their functions. However, they need to submit a plan that will show the potential environmental impacts. This is a way to minimize or avoid any environmental damage. Another act is the Endangered Species Act of 1973. Essentially, this protects endangered and threatened species such as plants, animals, or fish. It also outlined that it is unlawful for any person to possess, export, or import any endangered or threatened species, and it also outlawed destroying or deteriorating habitats. The last act that's the basis of this executive order is the National Park Omnibus Management Act of 1998. This is the main foundation because it was set to improve management, increase accountability of the National Park Services Program, enhance protection of the national park resources, and encourage others to use the national park system in order to study the park for the benefit of the park. So, specifically on this executive order, their policy was to figure out a way to fix the regulations that are currently there. Essentially, it became a problem because the security of the people had been put at risk due to the U.S. forest and rangelands and other federal lands. Also, because of the regulations that are currently there, it hindered the ability of the management to do its job, and also for active emergency responders to get to the crisis spot, so like a wildfire. So essentially, it wanted the Secretary of Interior and Secretary of Agriculture to implement shared management priorities. It wants the two departments to coordinate with federal, state, tribal, and local assets, and also for these two departments to remove hazardous fuels, increase active management, and support rural economies. So that being said, the goals of this executive order is that the Secretary of Interior needs to treat 750,000 acres of Department of Interior lands, which I'll show you where that is momentarily, to reduce fuel loads. Also, to treat 500,000 acres of DOI land to protect water quality, treat 750,000 acres of DOI land for native invasive species, reduce fire hazard vegetation by selling 600 million board feet of timber, and also provide maintenance of public roads. The Secretary of Agriculture goals are essentially the same. However, the Department of Agriculture for Forest Service lands are different than what the Department of Interior is. I'll show you maps of both in a moment. And the other difference is that the Secretary of Agriculture has more acres to cover within the executive order regulations. Also, the executive order outlined a coordination and efficiency process, which essentially they want the two departments, the DOI and the USDA-FS, to coordinate with the relevant federal agencies to efficiently implement and prioritize post-wildlife rehabilitation, salvage, and forest restoration. Also, to streamline relevant regulations, policies, process, etc. to the fuel reduction and forest restoration. So, meaning to collaborate with relevant agencies while also sticking with the requirements of the National Environmental Policy Act and the Endangered Species Act of 1973, both of which we have briefly mentioned. Also, the executive order wants unmanned aerial systems to be coordinated with the administrator of the Federal Aviation Administration to accelerate the process. The wildfire strategy will be a joint plan between the DOI and the USDA-FS. Essentially, the two departments will identify the most high-risk areas, prioritize those areas that have direct risk, security risk to people, structures, and high-value assets. Also to evaluate the cost and benefits of the management programs to include market conditions of timber sales and or similar forest treatment products to the extent of the law. Also to keep in mind the acts that were previously mentioned to make sure that this executive order and the implementations remain within those acts so that the process will continue to be legal. It also states that they want the Administrator of Environmental Protection Agency to reduce interagency barriers, essentially aligning all policy views between the federal, state, and tribal leaderships. Again, on the collaborative partnerships to reduce the fuel loads, restore watersheds, and improve the forest, rangeland, and other federal land conditions. Essentially supporting road activities by creating or adding to the Good Neighbor Authority agreements, and to pursue long-term contracts between the agencies. So essentially they want to create jobs out of this process. As previously mentioned, here are the USDA-FS lands that need to happen. So this is the Department of Agriculture. Where you can see is mainly on the west side of the United States and sporadically throughout the east side. And then this is the DOI land map. So you can see that there's a difference. There's not much on the west coast. However, there are some in the western part of the United States. If you look to the bottom of the map, please keep in mind these bureaus and services because these will be mentioned later. Key actors and interests. So the Secretary of Interior reduced the fuel loads by 2 times more than they were required to by the executive order. Keep in mind this is from December 2018 to December 2019. They also protected water quality on more than 1.4 million acres, which is 3 times the amount required by the executive order. They also sold more than 750 million board feet of timber, which beats the target set by the executive order by 25%. They also employed 4,500 full-time firefighters and rehabilitated 500 million acres of land. The Secretary of Agriculture has helped pass more legislation, which will be mentioned later, and they also want to give more power to the USDA Forest Service. Between the state government and the tribal leadership, essentially their interests are the same by protecting their resources and their communities, and a possible benefit off the timber market. With local institutions, they have a voice within Congress, but also they will probably benefit off the timber market as well. There were several negotiation attempts and a few reforms within the executive order, one being the Secretary Order 3372, which gives specific timelines and directions in order to complete the executive order, and aimed at the offices which I had mentioned on the DOI map. Public Law 1169 is 100 individual bills created by 50 different Congress members. Essentially, this is just reforming the current programs and activities underneath the EO, and it will also add wildland fire operations. Adding to that, it will expand to more collaboration between more agencies, as listed below. And the Secretary Order 3374 essentially is just creating a task group from the Department of Interior to implement Public Law 1169. So the effect on the U.S. democracy, I can see that this executive order would affect civil liberty, which would be the technology and democracy. Basically, rapidly advancing information and communication technologies have had a profound impact on democracy around the world. They have provided new platforms for civic mobilization and the dissemination of news and commentary, but they are also subject to censorship, surveillance, and exploitation by anti-democratic forces. While the United States is not anti-democratic in this sense, because there was a lot of available information about this executive order, be the White House website, news reports, blogs, etc. And speaking more about goes into the idea of freedom of expression, which is also pro-democracy as based by this quote. So the U.S. Forest Service spoke about the executive order and was very pro Executive Order 13855. On the other hand, you also have this key of freedom of expression by Lloyd Alters, who was very anti-executive order, basically demeaning Trump by saying that by him signing this executive order, he's blaming forest fires on the management, bugs, and drought, but not looking into climate change. He also mentions that by doing this, it's basically pro-business for selling a lot of timber from the national forest, which shouldn't, according to him, shouldn't be available. Also, being a boost in the drone industry for maximizing appropriate use of unmanned aerial systems, etc. So this is a good freedom of expression on U.S. democracy. The fact that the United States allows people to give a freedom to be able to say whatever they want, especially on a technological standpoint, where people can post whatever they want online, easy access in the United States. And that's it. Thanks.